Welcome to our one of our two DDD sessions, and I must say this is extremely encouraging to see hundreds of people interested in domain-driven design, along with how to use domain-driven design in with .NET. So welcome, thank you for attending and taking your valuable time to look into this. Just to, set the stage, I'm the author of the book Implementing Domain-Driven Design, which is based on the original seminal work of Eric Evans, and I'm also the instructor of the IDDD workshop, which you can find at IDDDworkshop.com. It's a 3-day class which is based quite a bit on the subject matter of the book and covers, in the first day, strategic design and architecture. The second day is devoted to tactical design, and then on day 3 we switch back to strategic design with integration and look at the rest of the application. So if you're interested in taking a really deep dive into this, I teach both public and company private workshops, so you're welcome to visit IDDDworkshop.com or contact me for further information. And I was hoping to get a couple hundred more followers on Twitter today. This is how you're going to find out most of the breaking news of things that I'm working on. And I do blog, and I'll be blogging further on this topic of using DDD with .NET and the later session at 5 this evening on aggregates and entities with Entity Framework and Azure storage tables. So if you want to take note of my blog or my Twitter account, you'll find out when those are available. So today, at this point, what we're going to talk about is sort of the high level. I hate to disappoint you, but you won't learn any secrets about optimizing your experience with Visual Studio. In this session, what we're really going to do is look at why enterprise applications as a whole, or enterprise subsystems, typically could benefit from having a domain-driven design mindset, using DDD on your project. And then what we're going to do is experience the mental model. What is a mental model? Well, this is actually the way your business people want to think about domain-driven, or about their applications, about the software, and how domain-driven design can be a guide to exploring and learning about what your experts think and how their thought process can be improved. And the two major tools that we use for this in strategic design is the bounded context and the ubiquitous language. And then we'll look at strategic design in some more detail, sort of a broader viewpoint view of strategic design within DDD. And then we'll also introduce you to some of the tactical modeling patterns of domain-driven design, primarily aggregate, and aggregate is the 5 p.m. session that will take you into actually how to implement aggregates with Entity Framework and with event sourcing and Azure storage tables. Okay, so that's an overview of where we're going. So you start out on a project, you talk with some of your team members, you read some requirements, and what you're modeling is a Scrum-based application management tool, which means that you're going to use the language of Scrum. Hopefully, you'll name your aggregates or your entities with names from Scrum, like product. Product is the thing that you are developing as someone working on a software project. And within a product, you have backlog items. And those backlog items, as many of you are aware, contain the stories and tasks necessary to complete a portion of the product. And a portion of the product is controlled under a sprint. That's where the activity of actually developing the software occurs, and then you have a release. So backlog item, release, and sprint are all considered part of your product. And then under backlog item, you have tasks, and tasks have estimation log entries. So as you work on each task on a daily basis or weekly basis, you're able to basically estimate how many hours you have remaining and any other helpful information about the estimation of the task. Notice, though, that releases have scheduled backlog items and sprints have committed backlog items. Okay, so that's sort of like a basic model. There's actually more to a Scrum model, but if you think about it, this is kind of where you would conceptualize the main parts of a Scrum application management tool. But then the team starts thinking about the problem that they're working on, and they say, oh yeah, and we need users. And this is going to be a SaaS, a software as a service application, so we need tenants. And within tenants, we have users, and users have permissions. And so you add these concepts to the model, of course. It seems natural that these belong there. After all, what will you do without users? And then management gets involved. The C-level management says, what we want to do? We want to actually integrate forum discussions and calendars into our model because we want developers and product owners to be able to have discussions about the product, the backlog items, the releases, the sprints that they're working on, even individual tasks. So let's add in forums, discussions, and posts, and we also want to be able to plan milestones in our projects. We want to plan for sprint meetings. We want to plan for retrospective meetings. There's a lot of sort of date-based things or calendar events that we want in our model. So let's build calendars in too, along with our forums. Oh yeah, and don't forget account management. How are we going to make money after all? Well, we need to have payment information, and actually this is going to be a lot more complex than just account and payment, but let's hold it right there for now. Let's just kind of leave those as a representative viewpoint of how we're going to deal with gathering income for putting subscribers in touch with our software. Oh, and yeah, don't forget also that we need to support these folks that are going to be using our software as a service platform. And so we need to have support plans with incidents. Yeah, that's actually non-trivial too. I wonder if we could purchase something for accounts and support plans. Well, we'll have to look into that, but for now, let's just leave these placeholders there. Oh yeah, and we have users now, but the users within the team, aren't they within a team? Yeah, it's a team, and each team has a product owner, and they have team members. In fact, there are even volunteers on the team. So wouldn't it be a good idea to include teams, product owners, team members? Oh yeah, and then there's resource management. How do we know that a product owner or a volunteer team member is available to work on a specific backlog item task that they volunteered to work on. If we try to set their time up for working on these various pieces of this project or a project, how will we know that they actually have time to do that? So let's add in time management, and we're going to model a time-consuming resource with the schedule and availability. Whew. And for every single one of these objects that are represented in our model here, there could actually be half a dozen, maybe even a dozen supporting concepts behind at least some of them. Do you see how this is kind of growing into a point where, what is the model actually? What are you modeling? What is the core? Is it time management? Is that really what your software as a service company wants to do? Is it forums and calendar events? Is it support? Well, all these are necessary things, maybe even commodities that you need to leverage. But what is the core? Where do we take this project from here? How do we deal with the complexity of each of these add-on concepts without losing control? I don't know about you, but I've worked on enough projects to be frightened by the outcome of this. I mean, this is just a conceptual kind of model that occurred over maybe 30 minutes of thinking, actually. But, after you spend months of software development, do you know what this model is going to look like? It might look like a model that I got to view at one point. There was a conference table in a conference room that started about over here, and 3 or 4 architects took a UML diagram and rolled it out across the conference table, and it may have stopped somewhere about here. And then each of these architects lined up at different sections of the UML diagram, and they would talk to a portion of the UML diagram that they were familiar with, and why this thing with an arrow from there pointing clear over here was related to this other thing. Now, do you really have to be that smart, have that good of a memory, in order to develop enterprise software? I hope not. Because I personally found that very confusing. And, it wasn't 5 minutes after I got clarity, or what I felt I had clarity on this portion of 12 objects or classes on a UML diagram, and then we focused over here, that I had to say, now, wait a minute, but why was that here again? Oh, so what you're saying is that this shares a portion of the concept that's over here. Yes. Okay. So when we face this kind of software development, actually, probably the dummy in all of us should just cry out and say, there has got to be an easier way. And that is what DDD speaks to, is the easier way. Now, I'm not going to try to tell you that DDD is easy, because if you were to try to control the complexity of this model that you're looking at here, or even the one in that UML diagram that I was talking about, it's going to take real mental effort. But the point is that you have the tools that are necessary to help you divide and conquer. And let's just say that it's no coincidence that I introduced each of the aspects of this growing, morphing model piece by piece, because perhaps you can even now kind of grasp where we're headed with DDD strategic design and how we're going to use the strategic design tools to try to find control of this. And, well, let me not say this model, but these models before these models become this model, one model, and everything is completely out of control. So yeah, we want to avoid this kind of, caveat, warning here be dragons, all those warnings. Don't get into this situation in a domain model. It's unnecessary, and you may even, in doing this, lose sight of what the really important things are, the things that your organization should really be focusing on, and you might be losing out on opportunities to reuse where reuse makes a lot of sense. If it is not to your company's competitive or business advantage to focus on any one of these areas. So in my IDDD workshop, I like to say that in introducing DDD to you, this is probably the most important thing that you will walk away with today. So, like if you trip on the escalator going downstairs and hit your head and you forget where you live, don't worry. Microsoft will help you find your home again. But don't forget this, because this is the cornerstone of domain-driven design. Bounded context, where you model a ubiquitous language, right? So what we're interested in is actually constraining, not in allowing a model to grow and grow and grow and grow, but actually what we want to do is purposely constrain the domain model so that inside a bounded context, we are modeling a single ubiquitous language, which means that the language is driving what belongs inside and driving everything else out. Now, many of you are immediately saying, bounded context, what is that? How do I sort of squeeze bounded context into what I know, what I use every day? And I'm just going to give you a little hint here because I think you need this. Many of you are just saying, here's another term that I'm going to have to go read 90 pages or 300 pages about before I'm going to understand it, and maybe I still won't really know what it is. Okay. Think of a bounded context as everything that you need for an application or a subsystem. So if you, depending on how you view your development environment, if you're using Visual Studio, probably are, think of creating a solution, a Visual Studio solution, for a bounded context. And within that solution, you might have a different project for your domain model. You might have a different project for your UI, your web interface. You might have a different project for your services layer, things like that. But if you thought about the solution as being the bounded context, that will help you at least follow the rest of this discussion. Now, there's also a caveat in that because I hesitate to tell you that a bounded context is a solution or could be like a solution, because it would be really easy to just keep creating project after project after project after project within that solution. And I've just hinted or expressly stated, don't do that. So think of a bounded context not only as the model and the services that are supporting what you're doing, but you also have to think of the bounded context of where other things don't belong. All right? And that's where we're going to discuss this, is what doesn't belong in the model that we just were viewing. And if it doesn't belong in that model, as in that bounded context, where does it belong? Now, let me give you another hint about this Visual Studio solution. If we are modeling an agile project management tool, then this bounded context and that Visual Studio solution will be called the Agile Project Management Context, or Agile Project Management dot, whatever that is, solution. By giving that Visual Studio solution a name, it's immediately telling you there are things that don't belong in there. Because what belongs in there is Agile Project Management. That is the context. It also tells you that every single term, phrase, paragraph that you write about Agile Project Management has terminology with a specific meaning within that context. Now, let me give you an example. If you want to support threaded discussions among developers working in an Agile Project Management context, then you're probably going to have to use some sort of term that describes the discussion that can be had on a product, backlog item, release, sprint, task, whatever. And let's say that the team comes up with the name discussion. No surprise there. So we will have, as one of these rectangular boxes in our model, something called discussion. But it doesn't mean that forum, discussion, and post are also in there. That discussion may just be a reference to something that's being managed in a different context, like a collaboration context. And in the collaboration context, that's where the nitty-gritty of collaboration takes place. Forums, discussions, posts, calendars, calendar entries, the events that fire because of having an entry in a calendar. So, is everybody kind of grasping this, that within the bounded context we are strictly keeping the ideas of a specific kind of model intact, and we're completely rejecting every other kind of model that we might be tempted to put into this because we're lazy or we're in a hurry. But instead, what we're going to do is purposely move all those other concepts to contexts where they belong. Okay. So, as you're practicing domain-driven design, you're going to find that there are two minds within DDD. And most of you probably are, how many are developers here? All right. And how many business people? Do you consider yourself more business people? Okay, a few. You're greatly outnumbered, which doesn't work with DDD. Actually, what you're going to find as developers is that you need the business people, the people with the thoughts of business, represented by money floating here, but, what they're talking about, what they're thinking about is the success of improving the business model that's going to make a difference in your enterprise or as a product that will be offered externally. But we also have the techies, the techie brain, the guys, the gals who are interested in producing good software. The problem is, between these two mindsets, is that the business owner is going to be interested in things like this. And if we're talking about Scrum again, they're interested in the Scrum type things: product, release, sprint, team, product owner, volunteer, backlog item. Developers, this might be a bit exaggerated, but remember that B stands for backlog item. A stands for product because it was originally called something else. And every time you have a discussion with your business person, you've got this gap going on between you. And the gap is a set of requirements. There's actually probably, like representative here, a third brain. This is the kind of business analyst type of individual who's generating these requirements. And so you have a translation that's going on from domain expert to business analyst to developer, and depending on how many business analysts you have and how many developers you have a different idea from the domain expert to the developer. You have a different idea of how this software should work, to the point where every time you have a discussion with the business won't know what you're talking about, and you will not know what the business is talking about. So the main goal of domain-driven design then is to unify the mental model. We want the domain expert and the developer to think alike, and we're going to do that by using the ubiquitous language. So we also already have a tool for surrounding this language called the bounded context. Within that bounded context, we have a team who's developing a model, and this model will be governed by the expressions that we use, the conversations that we have, and this is our ubiquitous language. Now, interestingly, notice when this feedback loop begins between developers and business people. You might think that it immediately leads to solutions. And it does lead to solutions, but the first thing that happens is questions. The developers start to ask, well, how do you perceive this working in software? Because you're talking about, physical things, the real world, so to speak, but we're dealing with software, and sometimes, many times actually, the real world doesn't make it nearly as much sense as, a projection of the real world. And so how do you perceive that this is actually going to work in software? And then you start having discussions that lead to breakthroughs, that lead to really understanding the great value of the effort that you're making within this feedback loop. And let me just give you, sort of an interesting example. We were in discussion, several domain experts and architects, developers, and we were, trying to understand this ubiquitous language. We were doing something called event-driven modeling, where we were looking at not just the data within the system, but as the data is received and as it's manipulated in some way, how is that data, what are the events around the occurrences within this data? So this was the exercise that we were going through, but there was a key domain expert who was unavailable for our meetings, and we had a couple of 1-hour sessions or 2-hour sessions that week, and we felt that we weren't really asking for too much out of the business people. We were trying to keep our meetings to a minimum, but we did need their feedback on how the software was supposed to function. So one of these business experts would not attend the meeting, did not see the benefit in this, and it got to the point where everybody was basically begging this guy to attend just a portion of the meeting. And so after about 1.5 of these meetings, this individual walked in kind of, disturbed, and of course they get me, the DDD consultant guy, to try to give the elevator speech on why he should be there, and that didn't do any good. So I suggested just sit here for 30 minutes. Just sit here for 30 minutes, and you don't even have to give us any ideas. I just want you to see what's happening in these discussions. And so he agreed to that. And in 30 minutes or less of attending this meeting, this guy has the aha moment. And he says, you're talking about, and then he uses a business expression that would do for most anyone experienced with using DDD, what the light bulb does for, most individuals in it. And it says, this is the name of the core domain that we as a company failed to develop 2 years ago. But if we had developed this core domain 2 years ago, we wouldn't be losing $2 million a year trying to maintain the data on a daily basis, using developers to patch our database on a daily basis because we didn't understand. We didn't have enough discussions. And that is exactly what we're talking about here. This is where, unfortunately, many times it's the developers who recognize the need to have this feedback loop with business people. It's the business people, many times, who feel way, way too engaged and committed to what they are already doing to get involved in this new developer DDX, right? Or XDD, maybe. TDD, DDD, BDD. I've heard all those DD things. So this is what's actually going to be, of benefit. But as developers now, let's switch back to you for just a moment. Is it a language? Inevitably, when we start going through exercises of modeling in software, what do the developers naturally do? They naturally draw those boxes with some lines in between them and put the nouns on there, and they say, that's the ubiquitous language. But that isn't actually the ubiquitous language. If we could get just a volunteer to come up here for a moment and describe your day from the moment you woke up until now, and describe it only with nouns. Anybody want to volunteer to do that? It starts with alarm clock, and it moves on to, well, let's skip that. And then, nouns are important parts of any language. And even in a context where our context is describe your day from when you woke up until now, that's a context. Describe your day only in nouns. If we all know that context and someone came up here and said alarm clock, bathroom, shower, egg, or toast, coffee, booth, Azure, SharePoint, whatever, whatever your day has consisted of, we would all tend to be able to make a little bit of sense of your day expressed only in nouns. But the language is far more than nouns. And let me give you an example with Scrum. This is linguistic, okay? A backlog item may be committed to a sprint. If the backlog item is not already scheduled for release, then it may not be committed to the sprint. When the backlog item is committed to the sprint, we will notify interested parties. That's actually linguistic. That's a language. That's part of a discussion that we can have with people. And as we talk about each of those items, we know what we're talking about because we know the definition of a backlog item, a release, a sprint. But there's still some sort of nebulous stuff in there. Think about this for a moment. Who's actually committing the backlog item to a sprint? Who? Who does that on the team? Everyone, maybe. Or we might have a business rule that says only product owners can commit backlog items to a sprint. Ooh, that's a problem. How many here want your product owner to be able to commit a backlog item to a sprint any old time they want to? No way, right? Okay, that makes sense. So by asking who does that, we've not only improved the language, we're making up some sort of a business rule. Maybe anybody can, or maybe just the product owner can. But if it's the product owner, don't they need some sort of, here comes new linguistic expression, quorum of team members to approve that this backlog item can be committed to a sprint? You know, that may not be the perfect linguistic terminology to use, but it gets us started, and it helps us with an idea that one or more developers will have to allow the product owner to do this. And this conversation has probably taken place in a team meeting of some kind, like a sprint planning meeting. And after that sprint planning meeting, a couple of developers voted and made up this quorum of team members that now the product owner can go and commit this backlog item to a sprint. This has limitless value to teams who perform this, because this is the point where you're really understanding what your software has to do in order for you to satisfy the users who use it and bring them to the goal that they're trying to reach. So you need to really focus on a language. Now, to kind of jump back to the point where we were just a bit ago, what we're going to do is say that this is the actual core domain. And this core domain is the agile project management context. Are there other concepts that belong in this model? Sure, but probably not very many. But what happened to all those other sort of commodity things? Tenants, users, permissions. What happened to those? What happened to the calendar event, the forum post of discussions? What happened to the time management? We still have a team there. We have product owner and team member. What happened to the rest of it? Well, notice that, for example, user and permission are gone. That doesn't mean that they don't exist in your enterprise. Probably everybody here will use identity and access management of some kind to manage the users that can sign on to their software and do certain things with the software. Of course you will. But what do you think that a product owner and a team member really are? In another bounded context, those are users with a certain role. They're users with a certain role. In our context, our ubiquitous language has told us that product owner and team member are the users of our software. They do things with this software. You know, every now and then the word user will no doubt slip out of our mouth, but in reality, what we really want right now as a team is to talk about product owners and team members. Remember, after all, it's team members who are going to have to form a quorum of approval for a backlog item to be committed to a sprint, because the product owner needs that quorum in order to be able to do that. if we were using the term user in the role of, boy, that gets in the way, doesn't it? Instead, we just want to discuss the things that really fit into this model. But notice, a team member is not a team member when they're working on a task. They're a volunteer. It's actually the exact same user as a team member in the exact same role of team member, but in this case, according to Scrum, volunteers volunteer, or team members volunteer to work on tasks. So this is the actual core. And notice, too, that discussion is in there. You notice discussion is there, but forum and post are not. That's because in this domain, we don't care at all about forums and posts. We're just interested in the discussion that takes place between product owners and team members. That's all that we're interested in. So we'll allow another bounded context to manage such things. So a basic rule of thumb with domain-driven design is use bounded context to separate models by language, right? So when you separate by language, so you have to ask yourself then, even though you may have a discussion in your language, do you have post in your language? Is it necessary? Does it get in the way? If form and post don't belong in your language, then no doubt they belong outside the bounded context. If those concepts start to mislead the team in their understanding of what is the core that we're working on, what is the most important thing that we need to, as a team, accomplish within this bounded context, then you're wasting your time by putting in extraneous modeling concepts that actually do not benefit. So what I've been talking about is this fictitious team that I conceptualized for the book and in order to help teams. And the interesting thing is about this SaaS Ovation, supposed company is, throughout my book and throughout the workshop, we get to look at these teams as making the mistakes that we want to avoid. Okay, and they make most of the mistakes that everyone makes with DDD when they're first starting out. But the story that I've been talking about is SaaS Ovation. They are developing as their new core domain an agile project management context. It's a multi-tenancy problem. So tenants, as in, like people who become tenants of an apartment building, you live in an apartment, you pay rent on the apartment. Actually, I'm saying this because some people don't know what a tenancy is. But think of this as an organization now who's going to subscribe to certain software applications that SaaS Ovation is developing, and when a company does this, they become a tenant. All right? And the early problem that SaaS Ovation experienced was the one that I've just been trying to explain to you to avoid. So avoid this kind of situation where actually their first core domain was a collaboration context. So they were interested in forum, post, discussion, calendar entry, wikis, blogs, anything that can help basically corporations, fortune companies, whatever, to collaborate as teams within the organization, within departments, cross departments, and so forth, to train, to discuss, to mentor, to enlighten, to support. But as they were developing this model, they made that mistake of putting user and permission basically in a silo, right, in this application. And user and permission were now tangled, actually directly referenced by calendar entry, by forum, by post, by discussion. And you know what? Most developers would say, well, we definitely don't want to develop a silo, so we need identity and access management to be outside this context anyway, right? We don't want a silo of users, especially not in a SaaS environment where you want as many users as possible to subscribe and use various offerings that you have. Well, that's true, but we could have discovered in the first place that this didn't belong, not just because of the silo situation, but rather because of the linguistics. The language just didn't match. Because if you're talking about the language of a forum, you're talking about moderators. You're talking about authors. You're talking about participants in a calendar entry or a meeting, right? You're talking about the owner of the calendar. So as far as the ubiquitous language is concerned, none of these concepts really fit in, or I should say user and permission didn't fit in at all. So this was an early problem that was discovered, and eventually by using the strategic design parts of DDD, they were able to discover that. And now, let's take a look back at that original, sort of out of control, big ball of mud model that was starting to form. Similar to that UML diagram that went from one end of the conference table to another. So in the center there is our Agile Project Management core domain. The term core is referring to the most important thing that SaaS Ovation could be working on at that point in time. It doesn't mean that it's actually limited to just one thing, but it's core because it's at least as important as the other most important things. However, notice what is not in that core domain. Tenancy, users, roles, those are not in the core domain. They're in another bounded context. Account and payment, they're in another bounded context. Support plan, incident, in another bounded context. Forum, calendar, and so forth, in a collaboration context. The resource manager, the time-consuming resource, the schedule, and availability in another bounded context. Now, chances are good that at least on some of these contexts, you could download open source or purchase a Microsoft product or someone else's product to take care of these other contexts for you. Maybe just with some integration patterns, the use of integration patterns, you can integrate with some purchased software in order to accomplish, these other 5 contextual representations of features that you need, at least support features. But SaaS Ovation wants to stay focused on what's in the core. This is one of their main offerings. This is what's going to distinguish them. Actually, this and the collaboration context in the upper right-hand corner, those are 2 of the core domains that SaaS Ovation should be focused on. It could be that they could develop these other pieces of software as well, or they could acquire them. They might even go into subscription mode with another software as a service company to perform some of these things. Now, what each of these things are is a bounded context. Again, a bounded context is a solution space. It's a place where you are actually physically developing the software, conceptualizing the model, but actually coding that model in C#, let's say, or F#. And So you want to think of each of these as being, for example, at least conceptually, a separate Visual Studio solution. Within that solution, you would have probably a domain model project, and the domain model project would have the core modeling concepts within it. Your web layer and your services layer and so forth could be in a different place. Your infrastructure of how do you actually persist these objects, which we'll be talking about in the next session, will be in a separate model and so forth. All right? But think of these things then as separate solutions entirely. Now, when we develop any software, especially in an enterprise environment, there's always brown. Is anyone here not familiar with brownfield development? What it means? Okay, brownfield development is where you have a legacy system that, in essence, you could call it a model, but the model is actually more representative of what's there, because all of us want to think in abstractions, and so we abstract this big ball of mud application or subsystem or system into concepts that we can think about, that we can make sense of. But when you look inside, it's just a lot of brown. And, it's not pleasant to look at. It's not pleasant to smell. But you know what's interesting about this brown? You see the little glimmer of hope? The little glimmer of hope is that green is growing. And so sometimes our DDD models are just like the little, small areas of green that are growing around the brown. But you know what? That's what really matters. And fixing the brown is just not going to happen. So how do you develop the green, the nice, crisp model that you see here? Well, let me ask you this. Where is most of the brown in this illustration, in this picture? Where do you think most of the brown is? You can just shout it out if you want to. Okay, there's a lot of brown spread between the rows. So we take the gift that we get from the cattle or horses on our farm, and we take that gift and we spread it between the rows so that the green will grow. Absolutely. And it's the same with any new enterprise model. You need support from those brown areas around the enterprise, or you can't do your job. But there's actually a place where the brown is even more concentrated. It's inside that sort of barn. Don't call it a silo. Silos where you put consumable goods. But inside this, and at a distance, is the brown. And DDD helps you to deal with the brown in this way. You encapsulate it, you abstract it, you take from this building only the brown that you need at any given time, and you use it just in the portions that's necessary between the rows to get your nice green model to grow. And in domain-driven design, we're going to talk a bit about context mapping. This would be called an anti-corruption layer in DDD, because we're looking at the brown model in the way we want to look at it in our own new crisp green model. Okay? So DDD can help with that. And again, this is what we call context mapping. So how does the Agile Project Management core, or bounded context, get its notion of product owners, team members? How does it do that? How does it get its notion of discussions and milestones, for example, in its calendar? Well, it uses context mapping to map the relationships between the Agile project management core and the identity and access context and the collaboration context. It integrates with those systems. It anti-corrupts the data that it gets back from those. For example, when it wants to know, is some user in some role, as in product owner or team member, Scrum team member or Scrum product owner, then it will take that data but anti-corrupt it because it's not going to use user and role in its own conceptual model. In its model, it's going to use product owner and team member. Same goes for discussion. There may be lots of forums, lots of discussions, many posts within a discussion, but all that the Agile project management context is interested in is that there is one discussion that, for example, a product owns or that a backlog item owns. And so in order to map between these various contexts, we're using as simple as possible API integration kinds of approaches where we're reading data from another system, but we're now anti-corrupting that by translating it into the kinds of objects that we like in our bounded context. And some of these context mapping techniques, I already named one, anti-corruption layer. There's open host service. There's published language. Those are heavily used, very sort of highly applicable ways of using context mapping. There are also team-aware approaches like partnership, like customer-supplier, that help us to understand the team relationships that we have between teams and the assumptions we can make or must make in order to help our project succeed. So there are, several different context mapping approaches that you can use, but like I said, some of the more popular ones or ones that you'll tend to use often are the anti-corruption layer against an open host service and a published language. Those can actually be implemented through REST or some WCF API or messaging or something like that. Let's talk for a few minutes about architecture now. And again, I want to point out that this is, roughly speaking, a bounded context. Okay? It's a bounded context because, well, this is a diagram about architecture, but it's a bounded context because what we have chosen is that in using domain-driven design, we're going to make certain that this architecture represents a boundary where we're supporting the Agile project management model conceptually inside of this and nothing more. And if you were to name this architecture, it's been named hexagonal, but I've drawn it in a circle, so there's no hexagon there. Some people might call this onion architecture, but if you want to get away from the shapes that you must draw the architecture in and just give it a useful name, it's called ports and adapters. So the ports are at the outside of the architecture. In this architecture, there's actually only an outside and an inside. And at the inside, as you see at the top of the inner circle, is application, and that inner circle is the domain model. Okay? So we actually create an API of sorts around the domain model. We model our product, backlog item, release, sprint, and so forth inside, in the core, in the heart of this software. The application is around that. Both of those things, the application and the domain model, are considered the inside. This is the stuff that, in essence, if you were to port, you could port this anywhere. Okay? Now, I only state that as I'm not I'm not talking about being a proponent of portability as in portable application architectures. Many times that just doesn't work out. But I'm just saying that in principle, if you were to think about the parts that port, it would be those parts. On the outside, though, are the adapters. They're the incoming adapters like a World Wide Web browser, right? Or a telephone, mobile phone, or some other cloud application that's integrating with you. The lightning bolt represents messaging. So if you look at those four areas to the left-hand side of the diagram, those are incoming ports, or ports that are interacting on their own to collaborate with this bounded context. And on the right-hand side, on the outer right-hand side, are the output adapters. As in, I'm going to store my model, my products, backlog items, releases, sprints, and so forth, someplace. And perhaps that disk at the top represents SQL Server. Perhaps the adapter just below that could represent, like, Azure storage tables, which is kind of, key value storage. The next adapter might be an in-memory grid of some type. And then finally, we have more messaging, as in outgoing messages, messages that we produce, whereas the messages that we consume are on the left-hand side. So the advantage that you have with this kind of an architecture and using domain-driven design is that you can actually plug in adapters as you need them. You can test the domain model before the application layer exists. You can test the application layer without the domain model. You can test, some sort of input device before the application layer exists. You can decide late in the game what kind of storage will we use. Maybe we will use SQL Server, but maybe we'll also use Azure storage tables for some reason. Will we need messaging? Do we need to accept messaging as part of our contract to the outside world for integration? Or will we merely produce messages? So we can make these kinds of decisions as we understand that they are necessary to make. All right? So use this ports and adapters kind of architecture to your advantage. It will allow you to swap in and out different kinds of storage, repositories and so forth for your model. Just a few of the advantages of using that. Now, here's another major gripe that I have, which actually, if you're developing software like this, you're probably neither using DDD, that would be a great, a far stretch, but you're actually not even doing object-oriented programming. You see this save customer transactional, okay, I'm sorry, this is Java. I snuck some Java in on you. But it's Java running in the cloud, so you don't know. But you know what? I started programming in 00 like in the mid to late 80s time frame. And if an object-oriented developer were to see a method named save customer, they would naturally ask in the next breath, save the customer from what? Because save customer would be a behavior that would actually do some sort of saving act toward the customer. But in the software that gets written today, this is a procedure that you could write in C#, or you could write this procedure in Java or whatever, but all that you're really doing is taking a bunch of data represented by strings only, and we're making the decision that if the customer does not exist when we try to read it from the DAO, that we're going to create it. That's what that means. That means if the ID doesn't exist yet in the database, then it means we want to create the customer. And then we check to see if any of these values are null, and if they're not null, it means it's optional, so we're not going to set any data on the customer. But you know what? This is not an OO model. This is a data model in a general purpose language. You know, this could just as easily be SQL. But instead, we've decided to write it in, let's say, C# or something. So this is a huge, huge problem in the software industry today. Not only are we just dealing with data, but we aren't even dealing with smart data. Look at all the extraneous properties that we have there. Customer first name, customer last name, street address 1, 2, city, state or province, postal code, country. Aren't those related? Shouldn't they be formed into a postal address kind of concept? What about phone number? What about email address? These are all just strings. How do you know that those strings are correct? Because they're not null? And this kind of software is what gets in the way of producing good software. Now, as you look at this, think about this next model. All that we've done is taken that customer interface and made the behaviors on the customer interface that represent the kinds of behaviors that we actually intend to perform on the customer. And we also take that extraneous data and we form it into what's called a value object, like postal address, like telephone, like email address. These are concepts that make sense to the business, and they're immutable concepts because, in this case, a postal address is just information about where someone lives or where someone works. But look at now how we are expressing the intention of the business. The intention of the business is that we might change the postal address at some point in time by just setting the postal address. That could be, for example, a user comes into the software and they have misspelled the name of the street that they live on. So they change that postal address and they click update. That's where we would just set the postal address. But to the business, relocate to may have another meaning that's very important. For example, if you are shipping product today for this customer and they relocate or give you information that they have relocated to a different postal address, that could be very vital information that you need to inform some other parts of the enterprise about. How would you do that? Well, we're going to talk a little bit later about domain events. But it's not just the fact that you are changing the data and that some piece of software somewhere needs to be constantly querying a customer table to see if someone's address is different than it used to be. Instead, we're going to be proactive and say, this customer relocated. We want you to know about this and all of the potential side effects that may have to happen because of that relocation. As in, packages shipping today, they were just using the website in order to order something, and now we want that package to route to the place where they have relocated to. Notice, too, that you can actually test software like this. You can write 1 or 2 tests, maybe 3 tests that prove that this software works, whether we're relocating to or changing the personal name of the customer, or whatever it happens to be. Whereas, you could probably write 100 different unit tests for that previous customer interface, and you may never actually understand that it's correct or be able to prove that it's correct. It can only be proven correct in all the ways that you've anticipated that it should work. Now, another important modeling tool that we have is aggregate. And again, at 5 p.m., I'm going to be talking in depth about aggregates and how to design good aggregates. Think of aggregate as a special kind of entity. Okay? We all probably know what entities are. It's a uniquely identified concept that may change over time. Well, an aggregate is a globally uniquely identified concept that may change over time, and it has a few very primary kinds of properties about it. It has what's called an aggregate root, which is and may be, it is an entity and it may be the only entity that exists. Or that aggregate root entity may hold on to one or more other entities and value object or other value objects internally. But the important thing is that there is a transactional boundary around aggregate type 1 and aggregate type 2. And there's a basic rule of aggregate that says everything within the aggregate boundary must be consistent at the end of a transaction, but other things in the system do not need to be consistent until some time later. So we're talking about both transactional consistency and often the need for eventual consistency. Again, we'll talk about that in the next session. And finally, another tool available for domain-driven design, a tactical tool, is domain events. So how will telling a customer object that it's relocated to a new postal address be informative to the rest of the enterprise? Anything else that needs to know? Well, if that relocate to method in that previous interface that we looked at publishes a domain event called customer relocated to, and if the correct interested parties are listening for that event, it means that another aggregate, such as who are we going to ship this ordered product to right now, can be updated with the new address just in time. So if this happens quickly within the enterprise, within minutes, maybe even potentially within hours, then this domain event can help us get the package that's rolling along, the fulfillment line to actually end up at the new address, the proper address, and not have to be redelivered. So that's all I have for this overview of strategic design with DDD and .NET. Again, at 5, I'm going to go over aggregates with entity framework and Azure storage tables using actually event sourcing, an approach called event sourcing. Okay? Any questions, briefly? Yeah. Well, describe mission critical from what your mind is. Well, I think for one thing, the bounded context is a context that defines what is mission critical and what isn't, right? Mission critical applications being what in which line of business are you talking about? Insurance, healthcare, what? Financial. So yeah, if you want to understand what your mission critical application is and what is most important to the mission, what is critical about the mission, then the bounded context is going to help you keep that in context and keep everything else out. That's one thing, yeah. Uh-huh. It's a good question. Basically, at the application level, all that you're really doing is setting up a, like an execution context for that use case or user story that you're running right at that time. And you don't want to see any business logic in your application layer at all. So if you see an if with some sort of businessy type thing or something about data that belongs to the model in your application, that needs to probably be migrated to the model. But just what you literally want to do in your application layer is like load up an aggregate instance from a repository, let's say, and just delegate or dispatch immediately to some behavior on the aggregate. And that's as much as you actually want to do, other than checking security. Is this the right user? Now, an interesting point about that that user aspect of it or security is bounded context for in order to get like a product owner or a team member through an anti-corruption layer. You're getting 2 for 1 on that. You're getting the business object that you need for that use case, and if you get back either an exception or a null, for example, for that product owner, it means no, they're not in that role. So you're actually getting 2 for 1 on that, just taking the step of acquiring that, saying, is this user in this role in another context? And if we don't get that data back and can't turn it into a product owner object, for example, then they're in the wrong, they're not in the role that they need to be to run this. Yeah, so actually what you would typically do is use a domain service as the front end. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, okay, so isn't it business logic to actually come up with a product owner or team member, let's say? Is there some business logic to that? It's part integration and it's part business logic, and that's why we would use a domain service rather than an application service to actually make that happen. So the anti-corruption layer is implemented behind the domain service because it is very much domain logic. And so we would get back that product owner from a domain service. To us, it's just this little veneer that outpops a product owner or a team member object. But in reality, there's a lot of stuff going on, including integration with another system, right? But out pops this object that we need, and there is some business logic to that, yeah. So we put it behind a domain service. But the application service calls that domain service and then loads the aggregate that it's going to execute some action on, and then dispatches to that aggregate by passing, let's say, the product owner that it got from the domain service. Yep. Does a domain service have what? No, well, okay. If a domain service, the question is, does the domain service have its own domain model? If the domain service is just a local business logic service, then it is performing its business logic on the core model that it is part of, right? That it represents. So it's just going to use the aggregates in its own model. If it's an anti-corruption layer, then it's actually getting data from another system that is not in the form that it wants to use. So it has to translate those object representations, say they're XML or JSON or whatever it happens to be, protobuffer or whatever. It has to translate those into objects that are in its own model. Welcome to one of our two DDD sessions. And I must say, this is extremely encouraging to see hundreds of people interested in domain-driven design, along with how to use domain-driven design with .NET. So welcome, thank you for attending and taking your valuable time to look into this. Just to set the stage. I'm the author of the book Implementing Domain-Driven Design, which is based on the original seminal work of Eric Evans, and I'm also the instructor of the IDDD workshop, which you can find at idddworkshop.com. It's a 3-day class which is based quite a bit on the subject matter of the book and covers, in the first day, strategic design and architecture. The second day is devoted to tactical design, and then on day 3 we switch back to strategic design with integration and look at the rest of the application. So if you're interested in taking a really deep dive into this, I teach both public and company private workshops, so you're welcome to visit idddworkshop.com or contact me for further information. And I was hoping to get a couple hundred more followers on Twitter today. This is how you're going to find out most of the breaking news of things that I'm working on. To add these concepts to the model, of course. It seems natural that these belong there. After all, what will you do without users? And then management gets involved. The C-level management says, you know what we want to do? We want to actually integrate forum discussions and calendars into our model because we want developers and product owners to be able to have discussions about the product, the backlog items, the releases, the sprints that they're working on, even individual tasks. So let's add in forums, discussions, and posts, and we also want to be able to plan milestones in our projects. We want to plan for sprint meetings. We want to plan for retrospective meetings. There's a lot of sort of date-based things or calendar events that we want in our model. So let's build calendars in too, along with our forums. Oh yeah, and don't forget account management. How are we going to make money after all? Well, we need to have payment information, and actually this is going to be a lot more complex than just account and payment. But let's hold it right there for now. Let's just kind of leave those as a representative viewpoint of how we're going to deal with gathering. We'll look at strategic design and some more detail, sort of a broader viewpoint view of strategic design within DDD. And then we'll also introduce you to some of the tactical modeling patterns of domain-driven design, primarily aggregate, and aggregate is the 5 p.m. session that will take you into actually how to implement aggregates with Entity Framework and with event sourcing and Azure storage tables. Okay, so that's an overview of where we're going. So, you start out on a project, you talk with some of your team members, you read some requirements, and what you're modeling is a Scrum-based application management tool, which means that you're going to use the language of Scrum. Hopefully, you'll name your aggregates or your entities with names from Scrum like product. Product is the thing that you are developing as someone working on a software project. And within a product, you have backlog items. And those backlog items, as many of you are aware, contain the stories and tasks necessary to complete a portion of the. And I do blog, and I'll be blogging further on this topic of using DDD with .NET, and the later session at 5 this evening on aggregates and entities with Entity Framework and Azure storage tables. So if you want to take note of my blog or my Twitter account, you'll find out when those are available. So today, at this point, what we're going to talk about is sort of the high level. I hate to disappoint you, but you won't learn any secrets about optimizing your experience with Visual Studio. In this session, what we're really going to do is look at why enterprise applications as a whole, or enterprise subsystems, typically could benefit from having a domain-driven design mindset, using DDD on your project. And then what we're going to do is experience the mental model. What is a mental model? Well, this is actually the way your business people want to think about domain-driven, or about their applications, about the software, and how domain-driven design can be a guide to exploring and learning about what your experts think and how their thought process can be improved. And the two major tools that we use for this in strategic design is the bounded context and the ubiquitous language. And then product. And a portion of the product is controlled under a sprint. That's where the activity of actually developing the software occurs, and then you have a release. So backlog item, release, and sprint are all considered part of your product. And then under backlog item, you have tasks, and tasks have estimation log entries. So as you work on each task on a daily basis or weekly basis, you're able to basically estimate how many hours you have remaining and any other helpful information about the estimation of the task. Notice, though, that releases have scheduled backlog items and sprints have committed backlog items. Okay, so that's sort of like a basic model. There's actually more to a Scrum model, but if you think about it, this is kind of where you would conceptualize the main parts of a Scrum application management tool. But then the team starts thinking about the problem that they're working on, and they say, oh yeah, and we need users. And this is going to be a SaaS, a software as a service application, so we need tenants. And within tenants, we have users, and users have permissions. And so you